If you want to continue to say, I am my ancestors' wildest dream, be that. You know, if you want to consider, yourself saying that, my ancestors, I'm walking in the foot or standing on the shoulders of my ancestors, then do that.
Yes, ma'am.
Because you can say that, but if there's no action behind that, then what's the purpose of that?
That's right.
Call a thing a thing.
Call a thing a thing.
Woke up this morning with my mind stay on freedom. Oh, woke up this morning with my mind.
I am the Reverend Lukata Mjumbe, and I'm the Executive Director of the Alabama African American Civil Rights Heritage Sites Consortium. Do y'all remember that song from Beyonce back in 2016, Formation? It was the lead single on her Lemonade album. In the beginning of that song, she says, Daddy from Alabama, Mama Louisiana. Well, in this episode of the Stayed on Freedom podcast, we are going back to Beyonce Knowles' daddy's hometown, Gadsden, Alabama. In Gadsden, Alabama, we discovered something phenomenal. There is a 100-plus-year-old graveyard, a cemetery, Southern Hills Cemetery that had largely been forgotten. It was overgrown and so much of the history had been lost. But thanks to the work of the Grace Heritage Organization, the land was cleared. Graves have been rediscovered and charted and documented. And what they have found is not only is Beyonce Knowles' family members buried there, but there are also business people, soldiers, veterans from the Civil War, leaders, and even a victim of lynching. We traveled to Gadsden, Alabama, members of the Consortium team and board of directors, so that we could find what was buried underneath. Join us in this episode of the Stayed on Freedom podcast, Resurrecting Buried Black History.
Grace Heritage was initially started as a passion project because we found the cemetery by accident, actually. It had not been cleaned or cleared for maybe 79 years. We had a lot of information stating that there were burials here. I did some genealogy for some local people along with my own family and found that it stated that 6th Street Cemetery was where they were buried, and we couldn't find it. So we looked, asked some local cemeteries and local morticians if they knew where the cemetery was. And they told me the general location, but we just couldn't find it because it was so covered in brush. So we initially set out to see if we could just locate some of the burials that were here. I had a class reunion one weekend. We told them about what we had found, and they were like, well, come on, let's go. And so we went. We climbed the hill to find that, at the top it's so thick with covering that it was not a lot of brush there. So there were a lot of headstones that we could visibly see. And I was like, how can this happen? How can this be a cemetery, out here in the middle of the woods? So I set out to find out who owned it, when the last burials were here, that type of information, and found the people who owned it. They didn't even realize that they still owned it. The owner passed away in the 40s, and the caretaker was the first black mortician here in Gadsden. He originally was a slave of that family. They got him set up in his own business. He was the first African American to have a funeral home here in Gadsden, and he cared for it until he passed away in 1956. When he passed away, it was left to the owner's 13-year-old daughter with the estate. And she never cared for it because she was 13 years old. So there was an association that was supposed to have cared for it, but they cared for another cemetery, which was the white cemetery. here in Gadsden. They cared for it, but not for this one. So eventually it grew up. The last burial is in 1972, but it was also a wooded area at that time. It's an 8-acre cemetery, and it goes down to the water. Alabama Power flooded that zone. It wasn't always water there. They created Lake Gadsden.
I've heard stories, I don't know if some of them are legends and some of them are actual history, where there were whole towns that were flooded for various purposes. We've heard about things like Lake Lanier in Georgia and other places, and that whole towns are now underwater. I don't know what kind of excavation work or archaeological work they did to try to recover information or whatever. Has there ever been anything done to try to identify if there are any, or where they are underneath, or is at this point, is that even recoverable?
I don't think that it's even recoverable. All we have is documentation from land records that states that this property was set aside for a Negro cemetery. So we have those land records from the original cemetery, which was maybe a mile from here, the 1849 cemetery. And then we have this cemetery that was a 1901.
Right. So the entirety of the 1849 cemetery, which would be enslaved African people, enslaved black men, women, and children, is probably in its entirety
In the water.
in the water.
I took that map and went to the county and had their maps department actually show me on the map where that property would have been. And it is absolutely in the water.
Absolutely. All watery graves.
Annie Albrook, the headstone says Annie Albrook, and it has DJ 32 and nothing else. No date of birth, no date of death, nothing. So I went to Savannah, and we did a tour of one of the historic cemeteries there. And I took the picture and I asked one of the guides, do you have some graves that look like this? And she was like, sure, have a whole section. Took me to that section and I was like, well, I don't understand the DJ 32. She said, well, I'll tell you. And this is something that you may not, want to hear. But that DJ is the person that owned her. And the 32 is the 32 bales of cotton she baled the day she died.
Oh.
It's called a name and production number.
I don't have any words.
People come here all the time looking for information on a burial, and they'll ask me if I found Maybelle Lee. And I can tell them yes or no, because I have cataloged every single grave for every single person that is in this graveyard. We have approximately 840 graves that we have cataloged to date, and probably that many more that we have unfound. This is an 8-acre cemetery, and we've cleared approximately 3.5 acres. Some days it's heartbreaking to see some of the things that have happened to this cemetery, to find out and gain knowledge of the people that are buried here and the work that they did in the community, and the fact that the community at large now doesn't know or recognize that these people are even buried here. They were unaware that this cemetery even existed.
Ms. Bostic, the consortium focuses on the preservation of civil rights, I'm putting that in quotation mark, heritage sites. Why is the preservation of cemeteries and burial places and places like this site important to the preservation movement, to the work of preservation in the state of Alabama?
Well, I can tell you from my perspective on this cemetery, We have some egregious acts that have happened to some of the people that are buried here as it relates to their civil rights. Dating back to 1905, Bunk Richardson was falsely accused of raping a white woman. And Brian Stevenson and his lynching memorial in Montgomery actually have one of our burials here celebrated in that museum. I worked closely with him to get the history and everything of Bunk Richardson because he was taken from a city jail, marched through town to the train trellis, the L&N Railroad train trellis in the middle of town, and hung. Governor Jelks at that time had told people that he had given them instruction not to touch him because he was not found guilty at all. They just kept him in jail for his own safety. They had found the two that were responsible for that, but they wanted him dead as well. So they took him from the jail in the middle of the night. A large group of white people. Yes, pretty much. They knocked the jailer out, marched him through town, and hung him.
So, Bunk Richardson was a black man who was falsely accused in 1905 of raping a white woman, was taken out of the jail by a lynch mob here in Gadsden, and was killed. And this place, this cemetery, Southern Hill Cemetery, is his final resting place. But the people who buried him had to do it covertly because they didn't want him to be dug up and buried again. And you said he's right over there? When were you able to get the headstone?
Last year.
This last year. So in 2023, we're finally able to put a headstone. Bunk Richardson, may he rest in peace.
We also worked with the Department of Defense or the Veteran Affairs to get most of the military headstones replaced. Like I said, we had a lot of stones that were damaged due to, basically it was some white kids that came up here on four-wheelers and ran over a lot of the headstones, knocked them over, and some were damaged beyond repair. So we're working to have those stones replaced, but we have to do it, through donations and to make sure that we have people in place that are professionals to actually help us, to guide us on how best to fix those things or how best to repair them so that they don't end up, damaged again through volunteers or something like that. So we actually do ask the professionals to actually come up here and guide us on things that I'm unsure of how to repair or how to even address at a cemetery setting.
So you were able to get the federal government to help with the replacement of some of the military headstones of those who were buried here.
Yes.
But I remember you told us a story of how you weren't able to get the federal government with a particular black soldier that was conscripted to fight for the Confederacy, and you took a different approach, and I think that grave is over there.
Yes, we have 3 Confederate soldiers that are buried here, and we asked for those stones as well. We provided as much documentation as we could, and basically they told us that that was hearsay. It was not something that they could verify through pension records or anything like that, even though one of the families in which he was a bodyguard for, they have documentation through journal notes for that particular captain. And they said that he served, that they served, but we couldn't get the military to actually understand that we had that documentation. They accepted all the documentation, but they would not issue us a stone. So I spoke to a Confederate organization, and they said, well, can you come address the entire group? So I did. Most blacks in them can, why in the world would you ever go and address the sons of the Confederates? Well, I see it this way. It's not my feelings that should matter in that incident. I have documentation through the Gadsden Times where they had a Confederate reunion here. And 2 of the 3 of those soldiers were there. And they interviewed them. And they were proud of their service. They were proud of the work that they had done. And they were still in contact with the man in whom they were a body servant for. We have a Confederate marker here, Emma Sansom, in the middle of town. There's pictures and everything that documented that reunion. But in the newspaper, they specifically, and it was 2 brothers, and they told of their time there, what happened there. Their captain was in a situation, and his group abandoned him. And those 2, he basically told them to go to the rear of the line. And when he turned around, they were the only 2 there left. And he turned around and yelled at them, I thought that I told you to go to the rear of the line. They said, ain't no rear. And he looked around and everybody was gone but them, but they didn't desert him. And they got him out of trouble and was able to get him to safety. And he rewarded them for that. He owned Woodliff and Dunlap Furniture Company, and they became woodworkers in that furniture company, and they were casket makers. So they made a lot of caskets for the people that are buried up here. Right here we have 3 Confederate soldiers that we solicited funds through the Sons of the Confederates to actually get these stones placed here. We originally just created a base to show that they were buried here, and then they created markers and had them placed here. We had an entire ceremony where they came up here in their full regalia to do the ceremony. And I didn't publicize it to the public because I didn't want the outcry from the public because of the negative connotations for that. But I felt like if they served in that capacity, they deserved to be buried in that capacity. And they footed the bill for the entire thing. They bought iron crosses, they bought headstones, they came up here and did their little ceremony. And the day went on without a hitch. So I think that my feelings about the subject is irrelevant when it comes to what they chose to do with their lives and how they chose to serve. Or, maybe they didn't have a choice. But through documentation, I showed that they did not see it that way, how we see it as a negative thing. They didn't see it that way, so I shouldn't either. So I allowed that to happen here so that we could have them recognized, because they're veterans the same as any other veteran, and they should be recognized for their service. We have some organizations like the Mosaic Templars of America was an organization that most blacks that were buried here were a part of. It was a mutual aid company, which was black burial insurance, because blacks could not be insured through a white insurance company. And that was before A.G. Gadsden, Booker T. Washington, all of those insurance companies. It was MTA. And there are 8 lodges that are represented here that were all over Gadsden that sold insurance to those individuals that were a part of their lodge. And with their death benefit, they received a headstone with their name an MTA on it, so that you would know which lodge they were affiliated with.
How many other black cemeteries are there in the state of Alabama that may have a similar story and a struggle, and why should we bring focused attention on what's happening here in Gadsden?
Well, I'll say this. I have found that most black cemeteries have the same plight, because once they have outlived their usefulness to a white owner, they abandon the property because it's no longer profitable to them. And I wish that there was some type of law or something in place that would protect the cemeteries. If they are abandoned, make it so that it either falls under city ownership or state ownership, so that they will continue to have the funding for perpetual care. And as I stated, like some of the MTAs, they were precursors to some of your social organizations that that functioned as civil rights organizations. They met, they did, their lodge meetings. So like I said, I have 8 lodges that are represented in this cemetery, but they met in churches. And some of the churches have minutes to show some of those meetings that preceded the civil rights movement, but advocated with the community for those same actions. So you had organizations, social clubs, all of those things that people that are buried here were part of. So that movement was the culmination of a lot of different organizations fighting for the same equality.
So let me ask you about that,
Okay.
because you have all of these names in your mental Rolodex. And I'm not going to ask you for specific names, but for civil rights movement activists and organizers that may be organized in Gadsden or in Etowah County, was this a place where they also were their final resting place? And if we were to look at the list or to consider those who have been buried here, how would the legacy of the civil rights movement and the human rights movement in Etowah County and in Gadsden be connected to this site as well?
And like I stated, we have an MTA organization, was Mosaic Templars of America.
Mosaic Templars of America.
Yes. They were based out of Little Rock, Arkansas. And I want to say the construction company that built their headquarters was from Birmingham, Alabama. They went to Little Rock and built that organization's headquarters, and had a lot of affiliates that were the national secretary for that organization is buried here. Her name is Amanda, and she was buried here in this cemetery. So MTA was involved in a lot of, the pre-work for civil rights movement, and some of the things that we were able to find that, some of the people, when they had problems, could go to these social organizations and they could help them solve some of those problems. We have a few of the doctors, a few of the merchants that helped in that movement before there was an actual movement. So, and some of the soldiers having, come back and been involved in some of those things. From the Elks,
Right.
we have some of the Elks that are buried here. And some of the headstones will show that they were part of those organizations. So some of the social organizations, some of the black business leaders that are buried up here had to, because they had property or had standing in the community, had to sign with a lot of people to get property, to get married, to have all of those things. But because they were prominent, or white people felt that they were established enough. Like I said, the first black funeral home owner was a slave of the owner of the cemetery. And he's buried here. His entire family is buried here. But he signed, he was a notary. He signed with a lot of people for property, a lot of people to get homes. And we have a lot of business leaders. There's a Reverend Dancy that's buried here. He was a minister that allowed people to come into the church and have town meetings about things that were going on in the community, things that were going wrong in the community. So a lot of those things can be brought back to this cemetery because this was the first black cemetery and was the largest cemetery in Gadsden. Before 1950, this was it. 1950, we had a cemetery in East Gadsden called Lincoln Hill, and Lincoln Hill is still operational. And it was first owned by a white man. So it was profitable. And as long as it was profitable, they kept it.
Kept it open.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Ms. Shari Bostic, we are so thankful that you have helped us to see that when we properly understand the freedom movement in the state of Alabama and across the country, that yes, it's important in these iconic civil rights cities of Birmingham, of Selma, of Montgomery, but we also understand that it expands beyond those places into the Black Belt, into Etowah County and Gadsden, Alabama, into all parts of the state and across the region, and challenging us to think about how we talk about our freedom movement and how we talk about our sacred sites, because it would be hard to argue that there is any site more sacred than the place where our mothers, our fathers, our grandmothers, our grandfathers, our children, our soldiers, victims of lynchings, leaders of churches and Mosaic Templar associations and other organizations, that there is any place more sacred than the place where they were laid to rest and where they were remembered. So thank you for helping us to remember to remember.
Beloved, there are abandoned black cemeteries all over the state of Alabama and all over this country. Buried black history. We need your help so that we can collectively remember to remember. I don't know if anyone out there knows Sister Beyonce Knowles, but if you can get a word for her, somebody in the Beehive maybe, get a word from her, that we need her help and that we need your help so that we can preserve our sacred structures, so that we can protect our authentic histories, and we can promote the legacy of empowerment. Thank you for joining us for this episode, and let's remember to all remain stayed on freedom.